iron. Caged and half-starved behind those bars, trembling in dirt that used to be her own front yard, and it would cost the Calloway family everything. That was the taste in the back of Hattie Boone's throat every single morning. The wind came off the pen, wrong, iron in the heat of the bars at noon. Endless ache in a leg that had been broken and set crooked and never once been allowed to heal right. That was her whole world that spring, because her husband was 6 weeks in the ground and a rider was 2 days out on the Silverton road. Coming home to bury a brother he did not know was already dead. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I watched most of it happen from the loft of that very barn, and I have carried it a long time, and I mean to set it down properly tonight, every part of it. So, stay with me. The best of this one is still a long way off yet. Before we ride into it, if this is your first night at this fire, welcome. We tell the stories the newspapers never printed and the histories never bothered to record. The ones about ordinary people who got backed into a corner by men who thought nobody was watching, and about the quiet strangers who occasionally showed up to prove them wrong. If you've sat here with us before, you know the shape of these things. If you're new, settle in. There's coffee if you want it, though I can't promise it's good. Now let's go back. Back to the spring of 1885 to a stretch of high grass country in the San Juans of Colorado Territory, where a woman named Hattie Boone lay in the straw of a livestock pen on the ranch that had been her husband's, and before that his father's, and looked up at a sky she had once owned every inch of and now only rented. I want to tell you first who she was before any of this happened to her, because a woman like Hattie Boone does not begin as a victim, and it does her a disservice to let anyone believe she did. She had come up from Durango 8 years before, the daughter of a freight line clerk and a schoolteacher, a girl who could read a ledger and shoot a rifle with about equal confidence by the time she was 16. She met Daniel Boone, and yes, I know how that sounds, and yes, everyone in 3 counties made the joke at least once, and Daniel bore it, with the patient good humor of a man who had heard every version of it since he was in short pants at a barn dance in Silverton, where he requested a dance twice and a proposal within the year, because he was the first man she had ever met who wanted her opinion on a matter, and then actually waited to hear it. They built a ranch up together on land his father had staked in the years, right after the war. 600 acres of grass and timber and good water running down off the peaks, cattle country, hard country, the kind of place that either made you or wore you down to the bone trying. Hattie ran the books, Daniel ran the herd. Between the two of them, they turned a modest spread into something that made the Calloway brothers 2 valleys over look across the fence line with an interest that was never quite neighborly. Old Silas Calloway had run cattle on the thin rocky ground north of the Boone place for 30 years, and he had watched Daniel's father build something better on better land with a resentment he never bothered disguising much. He had 2 sons. Wade, the elder, had a taste for whiskey that had cost him 2 ranch hand jobs before his father finally just put him to work at home, where the drinking could be managed instead of witnessed. Gideon, the younger, had a taste for money that ran deeper and colder than his brother's taste for liquor, the kind of hunger that does its arithmetic quietly and waits. Daniel Boone died in November of 1884. A rockslide on the high trail above the north pasture, his horse spooked and went down with him, and by the time the hands found him, it had already been 2 days. Hattie buried her husband in the plot behind the ranch house, on a hillside with the finest view of the valley, the one he'd always favored, and she grieved the way people do, hard and alone, mostly, because Daniel had been an only child raised mostly by his father, or so she believed. And there was no family to lean on but the hired hands who had worked the place for years and loved both Boones as their own kin. She did not know that November, that Daniel had a younger brother. He had mentioned one, once, years back, in the careful, closed-off way a man handles something he has decided not to discuss further, and Hattie had learned early in their marriage which doors in her husband not to knock on twice. She knew a name. Cormac. She knew he had left the ranch as a young man, before Daniel's father died, over some falling out neither brother ever fully explained to anyone. She knew nothing else, because Daniel had made sure of that, and because though she would not learn this until much later, Daniel had spent years quietly protecting his younger brother from a past that would have brought trouble straight to their gate. Silas Calloway came to call 3 weeks after the funeral, hat in his hands, offering condolences that lasted exactly as long as it took him to walk from his horse to her porch, and then offering to buy the ranch. Hattie declined. He came back the following week with a different offer, to lease the grazing rights for a fair price while she found her feet, and she declined that too, plainly enough, because she did not need her feet found for her, and he left with his jaw set hard and did not tip his hat on the way out. What she did not know, and could not have known, was that Silas Calloway had spent 2 years quietly buying up notes on the Boone Ranch's debts, feed bills, a loan against a bad season 4 years back. Small obligations Daniel had settled, slow and steady, the way most ranchers did, never dreaming any of it would end up in a single man's hand. Demanded whole and at once the week after the funeral, while the widow was still wearing black. She could not pay it all at once. No rancher could have. That was the entire design of it. Gideon came with the paper himself, 3 men at his back, and read her the terms in a voice so flat and businesslike it was almost possible to mistake it for regret. The ranch was forfeit. She had 30 days to vacate the house. The herd, the equipment, the land, all of it, passed to Silas Calloway under the terms of notes that had been bought up, one by one, in total silence for 2 years before anyone thought to demand them due. Hattie did not leave in 30 days. She fought it, wrote to the county recorder in Del Norte, wrote to a lawyer in Denver whose name she'd gotten from a Durango judge her father had once known, barricaded herself in the house with a shotgun and a great deal of stubbornness that the men who came to evict her badly underestimated. It cost her. On the 9th day past the deadline, when Wade Calloway and 2 hired men came to force the matter, she went out the back door onto the porch roof rather than let them in the front, and in the scramble down, in the dark, her foot caught wrong on the drain pipe and she came down 11 feet onto hard-packed dirt, and her right leg broke clean through, below the knee. There was no doctor sent for. That was Gideon's decision, made within the hour, made with the same flat efficiency he brought to everything. A woman who could not stand could not fight, and a woman who could not fight could be managed, and managing her, he reasoned, was cheaper and quieter than the alternative, which was letting a broken, furious widow ride to Del Norte. So they set the leg themselves, badly. Wade did it, half drunk, with more force than care and the bone knit crooked, and it never stopped aching from that day to this, not for 1 single hour. And then, because a woman who could not walk, could not run, and because a woman who would not sign the deed of full transfer needed somewhere to be kept until she changed her mind, they put her in the old livestock pen behind the barn, a low, sturdy structure built originally to hold a prize bull, iron-barred on two sides, walled with rough plank on the others, with a dirt floor and no roof, but a scrap of canvas Gideon had thrown over one corner, more out of practicality than mercy, so the rain wouldn't rot whatever paperwork they still hoped to get her to sign. She had been in that pen 3 months by the time this story properly begins. 3 months of half rations, enough to keep her breathing, never enough to keep her strong, because a strong prisoner is a bigger risk than a weak one. 3 months of a leg that never had a chance to heal right, swelling in the cold nights, aching in a way that had become so constant she sometimes forgot for whole minutes at a stretch that pain was not simply the natural condition of being alive. 3 months of watching her own home through iron bars, watching Calloway hands move her own cattle, watching Gideon walk her own porch some evenings with the particular satisfaction of a man counting something. They brought the deed to her every week or so. Gideon mostly, sometimes Wade, when Wade could be trusted to hold a pen steady. Full transfer of the ranch, all 600 acres, in exchange for, the terms varied depending on Gideon's mood that week, a small cash sum, or passage back to Durango, or simply her freedom from the pen, which after 3 months had become the only currency that still meant anything to her captors. Because they had finally understood what her father's daughter had always known about herself, that Hattie Boone was not going to sign anything simply because her body had been broken. Her body, it turned out, was not where her strength had ever lived. There was a fourth man in this, and I want to name him now because he matters to how this story ends. Marshal Ezra Tolliver held the badge for the district that included both the Calloway spread and the Boone Ranch, and in the 2 years prior he had developed a habit of finding urgent business elsewhere. He had been paid to look elsewhere. Not extravagantly, the Calloways were not extravagant men, but steadily, in a manner that had made him comfortable and complicit in roughly equal measure, and when word reached him, as it eventually did, that the Boone widow was being kept caged behind her own barn. He found urgent business in the county seat that kept him there for the better part of 6 weeks. That was the shape of things that spring. A crippled woman in a cage. A family counting the days until hunger and pain did what threats and paperwork could not. And a lawman 2 days away from his own jurisdiction by choice every single time it mattered. Hattie did not know, on the morning this story truly opens, that any of that was about to change. She only knew that it was cold before dawn, that her leg ached the particular deep ache that meant rain was coming, and that somewhere past the ridge to the east, though she could not have known it yet, a rider was coming down out of the high country on a road that led straight to her gate. I promised you the best part was still ahead, and I meant it, but I want to be honest with you about the shape of what's coming, because that's the only kind of storytelling worth doing. This gets harder before it gets better. There is cruelty in this story. I am not going to soften, because Hattie Boone did not get the mercy of a softened version, and I won't do her the disservice of one now. But I promise you this much plainly. The man riding toward that ranch was not what the Calloway family believed him to be. And by the time this story is done, you will understand exactly why the territory once whispered his brother's name. Cormac Boone had left this valley 11 years before this story starts, at 19 years old, after a falling out with his father, so total and so bitter that neither man ever raised it again with anyone, including, especially, Daniel, who had been 16 at the time and who had spent the rest of his life quietly guarding the secret of what actually happened and why his brother rode away that morning and never rode home under his own name again. Cormac's father had struck a hired hand for a mistake that cost the ranch 11 head of cattle in a bad winter, struck him hard enough to break his jaw, and when the man could not work and had no money and no family in the territory, old Boone turned him off the land anyway, sick and jobless in December. Because the ranch's books mattered more to him than a hired man's broken face. Cormac was 19 and had a temper that ran hot and a conscience that ran deep, an unusual combination in a boy that age, and he confronted his father about it in the yard in front of the whole crew, and his father struck him too, and Cormac, who by then had grown into his full height and his full strength, and had not yet learned the value of walking away from a fight he could win, struck back. He left that night. He did not come home for the funeral of the hired hand who died of pneumonia in a line shack outside town 3 weeks later, uncared for, and Cormac carried that death on his conscience for the rest of his life as though his own 2 fists had caused it, though they hadn't, not directly, and no amount of reasoning ever fully convinced him otherwise. He drifted south into New Mexico territory with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a grief he did not yet have words for. And somewhere in that drifting he discovered 2 things about himself that would shape the next decade. The first was that he had a gift with a gun that bordered on the uncanny, not the showy, quick-draw kind that got written up in dime novels, but something quieter and more useful, an unshakable calm under pressure, an eye that measured distance and wind without conscious thought, and hands that simply did not tremble. The second was that there were men in that country who deserved exactly the kind of reckoning his gift made him capable of delivering. Cattle thieves who terrorized small ranchers, land agents who forged deeds the way Cobb once had 2 territories over, hired guns who thought a badge or a bank account put them beyond consequence. He never took a name for the work. That was deliberate. A man with a name could be found, could be threatened through family, could have his history used against him in a courtroom by a judge who'd been bought same as any marshal. A man with no name was just weather, just something that happened to bad men in isolated places, and then moved on before anyone could properly describe him to the law. But a man without a name still needs one in the mouths of the people he leaves behind, and so the territory gave him one, anyway the way territories do. The gray rider for the color of the horse he'd ridden the first 3 years, though he'd long since traded that horse for others. The stories held that he never used more words than the job needed. That he'd once ridden into a camp of 6 cattle rustlers alone at dusk, and ridden out alone at dawn, and left the local marshal nothing to do but bury 4 of them and process warrants on the 2 who lived. A great many things got attached to that name, most of them true. Some of them exaggerated in the particular way that stories about a man nobody could properly identify always got exaggerated, because a mystery invites embellishment the way an open door invites weather. Daniel had known, of course. The brothers had kept up a thin, careful correspondence over the years, letters that traveled through a post office box in Durango under a name that wasn't Cormac's. Letters Daniel never showed Hattie, because some part of him understood that the less she knew, the safer both his brother and his wife would be if that past ever came looking for either of them. Daniel had begged him more than once to come home. The answer was always the same, not yet. There's still work down here, someday. Someday had been coming for 11 years when the letter finally reached him in a rooming house in Silver City in early March of 1885. Not from Daniel, who was already 6 weeks dead by the time the letter was written, but from an old ranch hand named Purcell who had worked the Boone spread since before either brother was born, and who had watched what was happening to Hattie Boone with a helpless, aging fury that finally drove him to do the one thing he still could: ride 2 days to the nearest telegraph office and wire every address he could remember Daniel ever mentioning, on the thin chance that one of them would reach a man Purcell had met exactly twice in his life. Years and years before, the wire found Cormac by luck more than anything. It said only, "Daniel dead, Hattie in trouble, come home, Purcell." He was 3 days out by the time he'd settled his affairs, sold what needed selling, and pointed his horse north. He rode through weather that would have stopped a less determined man, slept 4 hours a night at most, and arrived in the high country above the Boone Ranch on a gray, overcast afternoon, with a hard rain threatening and a feeling in his chest he did not have a name for either, though grief and dread together come close enough. He saw the grave before he saw anything else. Purcell had marked it plainly enough, on the hillside with the view Daniel had always loved, a simple wooden cross with his brother's name burned into the crossbar, and Cormac got down off his horse in the rain and stood over it for a long time, hat in his hand, saying nothing, because there was nothing yet to say that would have meant anything. Then he heard it, faint, carried wrong on the wind, a sound he almost mistook for one of the ranch dogs, until something in it, some specific human quality of exhaustion, made him go still and listen harder. It came again. A voice, a woman's voice, low and worn thin, not calling for help exactly, more like she'd given up expecting help some weeks back, and was only talking to keep herself company against the cold. He followed it down the hill, past the barn, to the pen. What he saw there, I am not going to dress up for you. A woman, thin past, healthy, her hair gone dull and matted from weeks without proper washing, sitting in dirty straw with one leg bent at an angle no leg should bend at, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the season, behind iron bars that had clearly been built for livestock, with a tin plate nearer holding scraps that wouldn't have satisfied a half-grown dog. She looked up when his shadow crossed the bars, and for a moment neither of them said a single word. "You're trespassing," she said finally, because 3 months in that pen had not cost her the one thing the Calloways most wanted broken. Ranch belongs to the Calloway family now. Ask them. Ranch belongs to my brother, Cormac said. Daniel Boone. Something moved across her face then, hope and grief arriving together, which is a hard combination for a starved, exhausted woman to carry all at once. Daniel's dead. I know I found the grave. He crouched down at the bars close enough now to see the full state of her. The leg, the hollows under her eyes, the way her hands shook faintly, even at rest, the particular stillness of someone who has trained herself not to hope too loudly. I'm his brother Cormac. She stared at him a long moment. Daniel never mentioned a brother. He never mentioned a lot of things. Kept me out of it on purpose, I expect, and I understand why now better than I did an hour ago. He looked at the lock, a simple padlock, county standard, the kind any competent locksmith could pick in under a minute, which told him something about how little the Calloways had actually expected anyone to come. I'm going to get you out of here. They'll kill you for it. They can try. He didn't say it hard, didn't say it like a threat meant to impress her. He said it the way a man states a fact about weather, flat, certain, already past the point of argument. Something in the way he said it made her look at him properly for the first time, past the exhaustion, and file it away. He had the lock open inside of 30 seconds with a bent nail from his saddlebag, and he helped her out of that pen with more gentleness than his size and his silence would have suggested he had in him, getting an arm under her without jostling the ruined leg. Easing her down onto a horse blanket he'd spread on drier ground behind the barn where the Calloway hands working the north pasture that afternoon. That was when Gideon Calloway came around the side of the barn with 2 hired men, and found a stranger crouched beside his prisoner with the pen doors standing open. I should tell you here that what happened next has been told a dozen different ways, by a dozen different men who claim to have seen it, and I was not there myself for this particular part, though I heard it inside the hour from one of the hands who was. What is agreed on by everyone is this. Gideon reached for the pistol at his hip before he'd finished asking who in blazes this man thought he was, and Cormac had his own drawn and leveled before Gideon's had cleared leather. That was the warning. Not a word, not a shot, a gun drawn faster than 3 men had ever seen a gun drawn, held rock-steady on Gideon Calloway's chest, and Cormac's voice, when it finally came, was quiet enough that all 3 men had to lean in slightly to hear it over the wind. "She comes with me. You can walk back to your father's house and tell him that, or I can carry the message myself, and I promise you'll like my version less." Gideon's hand stayed where it was, close to his own gun but not on it, doing the same arithmetic every sensible man in his position eventually does. "You don't know who you're threatening, mister. I know your father bought up notes on a grieving widow's ranch and called them due the week after the funeral. I know your brother set her leg wrong, on purpose or through simple carelessness. I know you've kept a starving woman in a cattle pen for 3 months to break her into signing a deed. I know all of it because she just told me, and I believe every word. That's Calloway land now, filed and recorded. Then it can stay filed and recorded while a federal judge looks at exactly how those notes were acquired. I've got some experience with forged paper and bought-off county clerks. It tends not to hold up as well as the men who arrange it believe it will. Gideon's hired men had gone very still, the particular stillness of men being paid a day wage who had not signed on for whatever this was becoming. Gideon looked at his own men, looked at the gun that had not wavered an inch in the stranger's hand, and made the only decision available to a man who valued his own continued existence. "This isn't finished," he said, backing a step, then another. "No," Cormac agreed, "it isn't, but it's finished for today." They rode out, the 3 of them, back toward the main house, and Cormac got Hattie up onto his horse in front of him, as careful with the leg as he'd been getting her out of the pen, and took her the long way around the property line to Purcell's line shack, a mile north, where old Purcell wept like a boy when he saw her and put the coffee on before either of them had finished dismounting. Now, I want to pause the story right here, because I promised you the best part was still ahead, and I meant it, and it truly is. But before we get to it, I want to ask something of you. If you're the kind of person who likes to know how these things end before you commit another half hour to finding out, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we tell one of these every single week, and there is nothing I like better than knowing you're out there listening. And if you've got a comment in you tonight where you're writing in from what time it is where you are, whether you've got your own feelings about crooked family patriarchs, leave it below. I read every one. It's a strange thing, sitting at a fire alone most nights and knowing there are people out there listening makes it considerably less strange. Now. Back to Purcell's line shack, and to the conversation that changed everything Hattie Boone thought she understood about her husband's family. Purcell fed them both. Real food, the first Hattie had had in 3 months, and she ate slow and careful the way a body that's been starved has to relearn eating. Small bites, patient, while Cormac sat across the little table and watched her with an attentiveness that had nothing performative in it. "You're the Grey Rider," Purcell said finally, into the quiet, looking at Cormac like a man confirming something he'd suspected the moment he laid eyes on him. Cormac didn't answer right away. Then, some call it that. Hattie set her spoon down. "The Grey Rider is a story. Ranch hands tell it around the fire. A man who shoots 6 rustlers alone and rides off before the sun's up. Some of it's true," Cormac said. "Most of it's not. I've never shot 6 of anything alone, and I generally prefer to be somewhere else entirely before it comes to shooting at all, if there's a way to manage it." He looked at his hands a moment, the particular look of a man deciding how much truth a stranger has earned in one afternoon. "But I have done enough of the rest of it that the name stuck, and I've never bothered correcting it because a name people are afraid of does more good in this line of work than a reputation for restraint ever would." "Daniel never told me he had a brother," she said again, quieter this time, more question than accusation. "I asked him not to. Long time ago." Cormac turned his cup slowly on the table, not drinking from it, just turning it, the way a man does when his hands need something to occupy them while his voice does harder work. "I did something I'm not proud of when I was 19. Struck my own father in front of the whole crew over a thing he'd done to a hired man that I still believe deserved striking over. I rode off that night and never came back, and every year I stayed away got a little easier to justify and a little harder to undo, until 11 years had gone by and I didn't rightly know how to walk back into my own family's life." "What had you become?" "A man with warrants in 4 territories and a habit of finding trouble that needed ending. Daniel knew all of it, kept my letters secret, never once asked me to change or come home different than I was, just asked me to come home, period. And I kept telling him someday. Someday came 6 weeks too late. I buried my brother's memory today without ever getting to bury the man himself, because he was already 6 weeks in the ground before Purcell's wire ever found me, and there is not a court in any territory that can give me that time back." Hattie was quiet a long moment, watching him in the lamplight, a man built like her husband had been, through the shoulders and the jaw, but harder somehow, more still, carrying something behind his eyes that Daniel had never carried. "He talked about you, not often, maybe twice, the whole time we were married. He said his brother had a temper and a conscience that didn't always agree with each other, and that someday you'd sort out which one was in charge, and that when you did, you'd be a formidable man to have on your side of any fight." Something moved through Cormac's face that he didn't try very hard to hide. He said that, Purcell, who had been quietly clearing dishes and pretending not to listen to every word, cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, boy, and I watched you grow up, so I've earned the right to still call you that. Daniel never once blamed you. Wrote to you every month for 11 years, hoping you'd come home on your own terms in your own time. Never pushed harder than that, because he understood you'd come home dragged if he tried, and he'd rather have you home slow and whole than home fast and resentful." Cormac said nothing to that for a long while. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the first real cold of the coming storm, and somewhere down the valley a coyote called, and another answered it. "I mean to see this through," he said finally to both of them, to the room, to the memory of his brother, more than to either living person present. The ranch, the notes, the marshal who's been looking the other way, all of it. I mean to see it put right, and I mean to see Hattie standing on her own 2 feet, on her own land again, before I ride anywhere else. On one leg that works and one that doesn't, Hattie said, with a dryness that surprised all 3 of them, the first flash of humor she'd managed in longer than she could easily remember. "You'll want to adjust your timeline accordingly." Cormac almost smiled. The same fraction of a thing his brother's old ranch hand would have recognized instantly if he'd known Daniel's own rare smile, though Purcell, watching, saw it, and felt something in his chest, ease for the first time in 3 months. "Then we'll start with the leg." He was not a doctor, but 11 years of hard country had taught him more field medicine than most doctors ever needed, and he examined the break the following morning with careful, unhurried hands, while Hattie gritted her teeth and did not cry out, though it cost her plainly to hold that line. The bone had healed crooked, badly enough that it would need to be broken again and reset properly if she was ever going to walk without a permanent, painful list to one side. "I can do it," he told her honestly. "Won't lie to you about the pain of it. But I've reset worse breaks than this, in worse conditions, and Purcell's got whiskey enough to dull the worst of it, and I don't think you're the kind of woman who wants me softening the truth to spare your feelings." "I am not," she agreed. "Do it." It took the better part of an hour, and it was, by every account I've ever gathered of it, one of the harder things either of them lived through in a story that had no shortage of hard things. She gripped the edge of the cot until her knuckles went white and made almost no sound at all, beyond a single sharp cry. When the bone gave way and reset, and Purcell held her shoulders steady and Cormac worked with a precision and a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the same hands that had drawn a gun on Gideon Calloway without a flicker of hesitation the day before, he splinted it properly. After, and over the following days, he built her a crutch from a straight ash branch, padded the crossbar with wool from Purcell's stores, and adjusted the height 3 separate times until it sat right under her arm without catching at her shoulder. He was patient about it in a way that surprised her. Not the patience of a man performing kindness for an audience, but the plain, unhurried patience of someone who simply did not believe in doing a thing badly when it could be done right. "You don't talk much," she observed on the 4th day, watching him whittle down a rough spot on the crutch's handle. "Never saw the use in words that don't need saying. Daniel talked plenty. Daniel got that from our mother. I got the quiet from our father, though I like to think I got a kinder use out of it than he ever did." He tested the crutch's balance, handed it to her. "Try that." She did, levering herself up carefully, testing her weight on the reset leg with the crutch braced under her arm, and, though the pain was still considerable, still sharp with every shift of weight, she could, with effort, move. For the first time in 3 months, she was upright under her own power, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the night she'd fallen off that porch roof, finally slightly eased. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went considerably past the crutch itself. He taught her to shoot from a sitting position over the following week, propped in a chair Purcell dragged out to the yard, because a standing woman with a bad leg and a rifle was a woman who could be knocked down and disarmed too easily, but a woman who could shoot fast and true from a braced sitting position. She had shot before, her father had seen to that, growing up in Durango, but Cormac refined it, taught her to account for the way her balance shifted without full use of the leg, taught her breathing and bracing. "You're a natural hand at this," he told her. The third afternoon, after she put 4 rounds into a fence post at 40 yards from the chair, tight enough grouping to make him raise an eyebrow. "My father always said I had a good eye." Never had much cause to use it beyond rabbits and the odd coyote. She reloaded, methodical, the way he'd shown her. "Never expected to need it against my own neighbors. Neighbors are just people you haven't had reason to distrust yet." He said it without bitterness, just plain observation, the accumulated wisdom of 11 years spent riding into other people's worst moments. The Calloways will come again. Gideon's not a man who backs off a losing position quiet. He'll want the deed signed before word of any of this reaches a judge who might actually read it properly, and he knows time's against him. Now he was right, and it did not take long to prove it. Word came to Purcell's line shack 4 days later from one of the Calloway hands who'd quietly grown a conscience over the winter and rode the long way around after dark to deliver it. Silas Calloway had summoned every hired gun in the valley he could afford, 8 men total counting his own sons, and meant to finish the matter at the Boone ranch itself within the week, before any federal attention could complicate things further. The plan, as the hand understood it, was simple and ugly. Burn what couldn't be moved. Force Hattie's signature on the deed under whatever duress proved necessary, and if she still refused, make certain there was no widow left alive to keep refusing. "They mean to kill her," Purcell said it plainly. Once the hand had ridden off again into the dark because there was no gentler way to say it, and no use pretending otherwise. Cormac's face, when Hattie glanced at him in the lamplight, had gone very still and very cold, the particular stillness of a man doing careful, unemotional arithmetic about violence he had every intention of delivering. "Then we don't wait for them at the ranch house. We choose the ground." They moved back onto Boone land 2 nights later, under cover of a moonless sky, and Cormac spent the better part of that night and the next day preparing the property with a thoroughness that spoke to 11 years of exactly this kind of work. He strung trip lines low across the 2 most likely approach routes, rigged to pull loose a stacked pile of tin pans that would announce any rider, long before he reached the house. He moved the horses to a paddock with a single narrow entrance, easy to defend. He positioned Purcell in the hayloft with a rifle and a clear line on the yard, and he built Hattie a defensible position at the parlor window with sandbags of grain sacks stacked at the sill, low enough that she could brace and fire from her chair without exposing more than her shoulders and head. "You don't have to be in this part," he told her the night before, checking the angle of her position one final time. "I could get you somewhere safer, Silverton even, with Purcell, while I handle the rest of it." She looked at him with an expression that had considerable steel behind it, the same steel that had kept her from signing a single document across 3 months in that pen. "It's my land, Cormac. My husband's grave is on that hillside. I have spent 3 months in a cattle pen refusing to hand any of it over, and I am not going to spend the one night that decides it all somewhere safe and useless while you do the deciding for me." He studied her a long moment in the lamplight, something that might have been respect, might have been more than respect, moving behind his eyes. Daniel would have said the same thing. Daniel would have been right too. They came just past midnight, 8 riders moving quiet across the north pasture, exactly as the hand had warned, and the trip line did its work. tin pans clattering in the dark loud enough to wake the whole valley, stripping away whatever surprise the Calloways had counted on. What followed was chaotic and fast, and by the mercy of careful planning and a defender who had spent 11 years surviving exactly this kind of night, remarkably light on real bloodshed for all the noise and the powder smoke and the shouting. Cormac took the north approach himself, meeting 2 riders at the paddock fence and putting both horses spooked and both men down, with wounds to the shoulder and the leg respectively, because even in the thick of it, some part of him remembered that the men riding for Silas Calloway were mostly hired hands doing a job they'd been paid for, not men who'd chosen this fight the way the Calloways themselves had. Purcell, from the hayloft, put a warning shot so close past one rider's ear that the man wheeled his horse and rode clean off the property without firing a single round of his own, which Purcell counted, fairly, as a clean success. And Hattie, braced at her window with the rifle Cormac had trained her on all that week, held her position through the worst of the noise and the confusion, with a steadiness that would have surprised anyone who'd only known her as the broken woman in that cattle pen. And when Wade Calloway came stumbling drunk and reckless around the side of the house, with a shotgun half raised, she put a round through his forearm before he'd finished bringing the barrel level, and he dropped the gun and went down cursing in the dirt, more surprised than seriously hurt, but entirely out of the fight. It was Silas Calloway himself who reached the porch. He'd stayed back through most of it the way men like Silas generally do, letting hired hands and sons absorb the actual risk of the violence he'd ordered. And he came forward only once it was clear the raid had gone badly wrong, gun drawn, face twisted with a fury that had nothing left of the calculating patience he'd shown across 2 years of quietly buying up debt notes. "This is my land now," he said, when Cormac came around the corner of the house to find him standing over the porch steps, gun leveled at the door where Hattie waited just inside. "Filed, recorded. Every scrap of paper says so. Paper bought with stolen notes and a bribed clerk isn't worth the ink," Cormac said, his own gun already up, already steady, the 11 years behind his eyes, narrowed down to this single moment on this single porch. "Put it down, old man. You've got sons bleeding in your own dirt and hands running for the tree line. This is finished. It's finished when I say it's finished. I have heard this next part told a dozen ways by a dozen people who claim they were there, and the honest truth is that only 3 people know exactly how it happened, and one of them was Silas Calloway, who did not live to tell his own version. What is agreed by everyone, including the 2 surviving hands who gave statements to the federal marshal 3 days later, is this. Silas Calloway's gun came up toward the door, toward Hattie. In the half-second it took him to decide that if he couldn't keep the ranch, he'd at least make certain the widow wasn't alive to enjoy it either. And it was Hattie herself, braced in the doorway on her bad leg, with her father's steadiness in her hands and 11 years of Cormac's patient teaching behind her eye, who put the round through his chest before his own gun ever finished rising. She did not hesitate. She told me years later that she never once considered hesitating, because a woman who has spent 3 months caged in her own livestock pen learns precisely how much mercy men like Silas Calloway extend to the people beneath them. Silas Calloway died on his own former neighbor's porch steps, in the dirt he'd spent 2 years quietly scheming to take, and the fight went out of what remained of his raiding party within the minute. Gideon, who had held back at the tree line through the worst of it, watching his father go down, turned his horse and rode for the county line without looking back even once, and was arrested 11 days later in Durango, where he had gone to ground with what little cash he'd managed to carry. The federal marshal who finally arrived, not Ezra Tolliver, whose absence from the entire affair had by then become impossible to explain away, but a marshal named Croft riding out of Del Norte on Purcell's telegraphed report, the forged and improperly acquired debt notes, the falsified transfer filings, and most damning of all for Ezra Tolliver, a ledger found in Silas Calloway's own study, documenting 18 months of payments made directly to the marshal's private account in exchange for exactly the kind of well-timed absence. Tolliver was stripped of his badge within the month and indicted on federal corruption charges the following spring. Gideon Calloway stood trial for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to false imprisonment and was sentenced to 11 years at the Territorial Penitentiary, a sentence, I've always privately thought, that carried a certain rough justice in its number, though I doubt the judge intended the echo. Wade Calloway, whose forearm wound left him with a hand that never fully closed right again, testified against his brother in exchange for a reduced sentence, and served 4 years before disappearing from the territory entirely, last reported working a mine outside Leadville. The ranch, of course, reverted entirely to Hattie Boone. Every deed and note and forfeiture claim the Calloways had ever filed against it thrown out by Marshal Croft's federal report inside of a month. She healed slow that summer. The leg never sat perfectly straight. There is only so much even careful field surgery can undo after 3 months of neglect, and she carried a slight list to her walk for the rest of her life, favored the crutch on bad weather days for years afterward, and never once, in all the time I knew her, complained about it, because she had traded that leg, on her own telling, for a ranch and a life and a version of herself that no cage had ultimately managed to break. Cormac stayed through the summer. He mended fence, worked the herd back up from the neglect of 3 chaotic months, sat some evenings on the porch with Hattie while Purcell told the same 3 stories he always told, and both of them let him, because a man who'd waited that long to be useful again deserved an audience. I won't pretend to you that nothing grew between them in those months, because something plainly did, a quiet, careful, patient kind of regard that had nothing hurried about it, and everything earned, forged in a cattle pen and a lying shack. But I also won't dress it up into something it wasn't. What grew between Cormac Boone and his brother's widow that summer was not, in the end, a romance in the way the dime novels would have told it. It was something rarer and in some ways sturdier, a bond between 2 people who had each, in their own separate ways, been abandoned by the world's ordinary mercies and had found in each other a kind of family neither had expected to have again. He was the brother Daniel had lost. She was the sister-in-law he'd never had the chance to properly meet. And by the end of that summer, both of them had come to understand that what they'd built together was not going to become a marriage, and did not need to, because it was already exactly the right shape for what it was. He rode out in September, when the herd was settled and the fences were mended, and Hattie could manage the crutch across the whole spread without needing to stop and rest twice along the way. You could stay, she told him on the porch, the morning he packed his saddlebags. There's work enough here for 2 lifetimes, let alone one man's restless nature. There's other Hatties out there, he said, and it wasn't unkind, just true, the particular truth of a man who had finally, after 11 years, made a kind of peace with the shape of the life he'd chosen. Other ranches, other widows, other families who bought up notes on people who couldn't fight back. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I'd spend this gift on people who needed it, and I don't believe I'm finished yet. Daniel would have wanted you to stay. Daniel would have understood exactly why I can't. He knew what I was, better than anyone, and he never once asked me to be less of it. Just asked me to come home sometimes. He looked at the ranch house, the barn, the hillside grave with its wooden cross, all of it settled now under a clean September sky. I came home. Took 11 years and a wire from Purcell to manage it, but I came home and I got to see him one more time, even if it was only the ground he's resting in. That's more than I had any right to expect. She reached up and touched his face briefly, the way you'd touch a brother's face, and he let her, and neither of them made more of it than it was. "Come back," she said. "Not because you have to, because there'll always be a place at this table. I will." And, unusually for him, he meant it plainly enough that she believed him without reservation. "Every year or two, if the work allows it, I'd like to watch this place keep growing. I'd like to watch you keep proving every single Calloway wrong." He rode south that morning, the same unhurried, watchful pace he rode everywhere. And Hattie stood on the porch on her crutch and watched him until the road bent around the ridge, and the dust settled, and there was nothing left of him but the memory of a man who had ridden 2 days through hard weather because a dying stranger's telegram used the word. Trouble about a woman he'd never met. Now I want to tell you what happened after, because a story like this one has earned its full ending. Hattie Boone ran that ranch for another 31 years. She never remarried, not for lack of offers. There were several over the years, from decent men in 3 counties who'd heard some version of her story and admired the steel in it. But she told her closest friends, late in life, that she'd already had the 2 great loves a person is generally allotted, one a husband and one something harder to name. And she didn't feel the lack of a third. She expanded the herd, brought on Purcell's grandson as foreman when the old man finally retired to a rocking chair on her own porch in 1897, and became, by most local accounts, one of the most quietly respected ranchers in that stretch of the San Juans. Some of the same neighbors who'd looked the other way during her 3 months in that cage came to for advice on hard winters and harder markets. She died in 1931, in the same ranch house, in a bed positioned so she could see the hillside grave from her window. And her last words, according to the granddaughter who was with her, were that she hoped Daniel had kept the coffee on. Cormac Boone did come back, as promised most years, though never for more than a few weeks at a stretch, and the stories that trailed him through those years only grew stranger and more elaborate in the telling. A family of homesteaders in the Sangre de Cristos, protected through a full season from a land baron's hired guns. A marshal in a town I won't name here still owes his badge, some say to a quiet word from a man who was never formally introduced. I have no way of confirming most of it. I know only what I saw myself, and what Hattie told me in her later years, sitting on that same porch with her bad leg propped on a stool, and her eyes still sharp as anything. The last confirmed sighting of him that I've ever been able to verify was in 1897 in a supply store in Ouray, a shopkeeper's account of a quiet, gray-eyed man who paid in cash, asked after the road conditions toward the San Juans. After that, the trail goes the way these trails generally do, thin, then thinner, then nothing but rumor, and the occasional half-remembered story told by old-timers who may or may not have actually met him. I like to think he's still out there somewhere, or was for a good long while after that. that there's a woman in some forgotten corner of some territory who does not yet know that a stranger with a quiet voice and steady hands is 2 days out on a bad road, coming because someone finally sent word that she needed him, arriving in time to cut a lock, splint a leg. That is the story of Hattie Boone, crippled and caged on her own land in the spring of 1885, and the brother-in-law who came home a stranger and left a legend confirmed. I watched a good part of it from that hayloft, 20-some years old, and half convinced the whole valley had gone mad. And I have told this story more times than I can properly count since, and it never gets any easier to tell the part about the cage. Now, this story is a work of fiction, made for your entertainment. The characters, the events, and the town of the Boone Ranch as depicted here are invented. Any resemblance to real people or real history. This story was written and produced with the assistance of artificial intelligence tools. If this one held you tonight, the kindest thing you can do is hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and there is something steadying about knowing there are people out there sitting up with these old stories, same as I am. Thank you for being here. We'll light this fire again soon.